The dining room had that particular kind of quiet that only comes from a family pretending to be civil. 12 chairs. A dark wood table that had belonged to my mother-in-law's mother. Crystal water glasses nobody was drinking from, because nobody wanted to be the one to make a sound. I sat at the far end, near the corner where the light from the window didn't quite reach. Vanessa sat at the head. Mark's chair, though nobody said that out loud, though everyone in that room felt it. She stood up slowly, smoothed the front of her blazer, opened a manila folder in front of her, like she was about to deliver a quarterly report instead of gut a grieving woman in front of witnesses. "Let's be honest," she said, slowly, deliberately, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. "She's not even family. She gets nothing." Nobody objected. I watched my husband's cousin study his own hands like they'd suddenly become fascinating. I watched his mother stare at the tablecloth, at a water stain near the centerpiece, at anything that wasn't me. 12 people. Not one of them said a word. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I just sat there in the silence Vanessa had built for me, brick by brick, for 3 years, and let it hold me like it always had. Then the door opened. A man in a gray suit stepped in, a leather briefcase in one hand, unbothered by the 12 heads that turned toward him. "Before you go any further," he said, calm as a Tuesday afternoon, "I think you'll want to hear what Mark left instructions for. I want you to imagine that moment. Not the shock on Vanessa's face, I'll get to that. I mean the moment right before, the half second where I still believed I had nothing, where I still believed my husband's family had won, the way they'd been winning quietly for years, because I'd been called a lot of things by that family. Overbearing, distant, not one of us. That day, I found out what my husband had actually called me, in writing, with a lawyer in the room to make sure no one could ever argue with it again. My name is Rachel. And this is the story of the day I stopped disappearing for people who never once made room for me. Before we get into it, if you're new here, welcome to Her Quiet Reckoning, where we tell true inspired stories about the women who got underestimated, pushed aside and written off, right up until the moment they weren't. If that sounds like your kind of story, hit subscribe now, because you're going to want to see how this one ends. Now, back to that dining room. I need you to understand something before I tell you the rest. I was never a woman who needed rescuing. I want to be clear about that, because so much of what happened to me in that family started with them deciding, quietly and immediately, that I did. Before I met Mark, I ran the patient logistics department at a regional hospital system. 41 years old when I'm telling you this now, but back then, back when this all started, I was 34, and I had spent 12 years building a career that had nothing to do with anyone's last name. I owned my condo outright by the time I was 32. I paid my own way through grad school. I didn't come into Mark's life needing anything from him, financially or otherwise, and that detail matters more than you'd think, because it's the one fact Vanessa could never quite explain away, no matter how many times she tried. We met at a hospital fundraising gala, of all places. Mark was there representing his family's construction firm, one of the event's sponsors, and I was there representing my department, mostly bored out of my mind, until a man in an ill-fitting rented tuxedo asked me, with complete sincerity, whether the shrimp cocktail was ethically sourced. I laughed for the first time all night. That was Mark. Warm, a little goofy, allergic to pretension in a family absolutely drowning in it. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. Married at 36, him at 38. It wasn't a whirlwind. It wasn't reckless. It was 2 adults who'd both been burned before, being careful and then being sure. I tell you all this because I want you to understand. I didn't marry into that family blind. I walked in with my eyes open, my own money, my own name, and my own life. What I didn't walk in with was any idea of how hard Vanessa would work, for years, to make sure none of that mattered. My first real exposure to the family came at Thanksgiving, our first holiday as a married couple. 3 years after the wedding, if you can believe that, because Mark's job had kept us traveling the 2 Thanksgivings before. Vanessa hosted, as she always did. She stood at the head of her parents' table, glass of wine in hand, and introduced me to a guest I'd never met, an elderly aunt visiting from out of state, as Mark's girlfriend. 3 years married. A ring on my finger she'd watched me wear at her own daughter's christening. Mark's girlfriend. I corrected her gently in front of the aunt. Actually, his wife. We got married in the spring. Vanessa smiled, waved a hand like it was nothing, like language was just a technicality. Of course. I always forget. You two are just so low-key about it. She said it like a compliment. It wasn't. Later that same visit, I noticed something small. The kind of small that tells you everything if you're paying attention. The family had a photo wall in the front hallway of Mark's parents' house. Decades of school photos, engagement photos, grandkid photos, arranged with real care. Our wedding photo was there, but it wasn't on the wall. It sat on a side table near the coat closet, in a smaller frame than everyone else's, slightly turned, like someone had bumped it reaching for their keys and never bothered to straighten it back. I didn't say anything. I told myself I was being sensitive. That's the first lie this family teaches you to tell yourself, and it's the most effective one they have. I want to tell you about one more early moment, because I think it's the one that should have warned me the most, and didn't, because it was dressed up as generosity. About 6 months into the marriage, Vanessa took me to lunch, just the two of us, her idea, and I remember being genuinely touched that she wanted to make the effort. We sat at a bistro downtown, and about halfway through the meal, she set down her fork and said, in a tone so gentle it almost sounded like concern, I just want you to know whatever happens with you and Mark, you'll always be welcome at family things. As a guest. As a guest, not as family. As a guest, the way you'd describe a coworker's spouse you were being polite to at an office party. I laughed it off at the time, told her that was sweet of her, and drove home telling myself she'd just phrased it awkwardly. It took me years to understand that she hadn't misphrased anything. She'd told me exactly where she'd already decided I belonged. 6 months into a marriage that would go on to last more than a decade. Mark, for what it's worth, was not blind to any of this, even in those early years, though he handled it the way a lot of good, conflict-averse men handle a difficult sibling. By minimizing it, by running interference where he could, by quietly correcting people without making it a whole confrontation. That's not what she meant, he'd tell me on the drive home from these events. And I believed him, mostly because I wanted to, and partly because I didn't yet have the full pattern laid out in front of me the way I do telling you this story now. It's only in hindsight, sitting here years later with everything that eventually happened, that I can see how consistent it all was. Every single interaction, small as it seemed in the moment, was pointing the exact same direction. What I understood much later, what took me years to fully see, was that Vanessa had spent her whole life as the successful one. Older sister, law degree, a husband in finance, a house with a wine cellar, and then Mark, the baby of the family, the golden child who could do no wrong in their parents' eyes, went and fell in love with a hospital administrator Vanessa had quietly decided was beneath the family's tier. It didn't matter that I made a good living. It didn't matter that I was kind to her children, remembered her husband's birthday, showed up to every single event she ever hosted. In Vanessa's mind, I was a rounding error in Mark's story. Someone he'd grow out of eventually, the way you grow out of a phase. She was wrong. But it would take a death, a lawyer, and a locked drawer for her to find that out. The years that followed weren't dramatic, at least not on the surface. That's the part people don't understand about this kind of exclusion. It rarely looks like cruelty from the outside. It looks like forgetting. It looks like small logistics. It looks like nothing until you add it up. At every holiday, the seating arrangement was the same. Mark's cousins and their spouses sat clustered near the head of the table, close to his parents. I sat at the far end, close enough to the kids' table that I ended up cutting more turkey for 8-year-olds than I ever ate myself. Mark noticed eventually and started sitting with me down there instead of near his parents, which I loved him for. But it also meant every year, a small and wordless statement was made about where I belonged in that house. There was the family reunion, an every other year event Vanessa organized with military precision, where my name was left off the printed invitation not once, but twice, 2 reunions running. I'm so sorry, Rachel. I must have just assumed Mark would tell you the details, she said the first time. The second time, she didn't apologize at all. She just laughed and said, "We really need a better system." Like the absence of my name from a printed card was a filing error and not a message. There was a birthday dinner for Mark's father where Vanessa stood to give a toast. She raised her glass, looked around the table with real warmth in her eyes, and said, "To family. Real family." She was looking at her husband, at her kids, at her parents. She was very deliberately not looking at me, 3 feet to her left, and everyone at that table understood exactly what she meant and exactly who she'd excluded, and exactly why nobody was going to say anything about it. There was also, I should mention, the matter of the family group chat, a thread called simply The Fam, created years before I ever entered the picture, that Mark had been part of since it was founded. I was never added to it, not once in over a decade. Birthdays got planned there, photos got shared there, small, ordinary family jokes lived there, the kind that build a shared language over years. I found out about its existence almost by accident, catching a glimpse of Mark's phone screen one evening while he laughed at something on it. And when I asked what it was, he looked almost embarrassed and said he'd just never thought to ask Vanessa to add me. I asked him to ask her. He did. She said she would look into it, and then, as far as I know, never did. And eventually the subject just quietly stopped coming up, the way so many small humiliations do, not resolved, just absorbed into the background noise of a life. I want to pause here and say something, because I think it matters. I never fought back during these years, not because I was weak, I want to be very clear about that, but because I'd made a calculation, the kind so many of us make without ever naming it out loud, that fighting Vanessa in front of the family would cost Mark more than it would cost her. He loved his sister, in the complicated, obligated way you love a sibling who's disappointed you 100 times, and you keep hoping the 101st time will be different. I wasn't going to be the reason he had to choose, so I absorbed it, quietly, every single time. Then Mark got sick. It was a Tuesday when we got the diagnosis, pancreatic cancer. Caught later than anyone wanted, 18 months before he died. Though of course we didn't know the timeline then. What I know now, looking back, is that illness doesn't create character. It reveals it. And in the 18 months that followed, I watched, in real time, exactly who each person in that family actually was underneath the holiday toasts and the seating charts. I became his primary caregiver almost immediately. And not because anyone assigned me that role, because I was the one who was there. I learned to manage a medication schedule that shifted every few weeks as his treatment changed. I was up at 2 a.m. more nights than I could count, checking his temperature, adjusting his pillows so the nausea wouldn't hit as hard, sitting with him through the worst of it because being alone with pain like that is its own kind of unbearable. Mark's mother visited during the day, only during the day. She'd arrive around 11, sit with him for an hour, bring a casserole dish she'd drop at the door like a delivery service, and call it checking in. I don't think she ever once saw what 2 a.m. looked like in that house. I don't think she wanted to. Vanessa came exactly once during the entire course of his chemotherapy. She stayed 20 minutes. She hugged him, took a photo of the two of them that made it look like she'd spent the whole afternoon there, and posted it that evening with a caption about supporting my brother through this fight that collected 40-some comments from people who had no idea she'd been in the house shorter than it takes to watch a sitcom episode. I quit my job around month 7. It wasn't a small decision. I'd built that career for over a decade, and walking away from it meant walking away from a salary, a retirement match, a professional identity I'd worked hard for. But Mark needed someone there full-time, and I was the one who could be, so I was. Nobody in that family ever once acknowledged what that cost me. Not the money. Not the years. Not the version of my career that simply stopped existing the day I made that call. I remember the exact conversation with my department director, sitting in her office with the door closed, trying to explain that I needed to step away indefinitely, and not really having the words for how indefinite might turn out to be. She was kind about it. She told me the door would always be open, which I appreciated, even though we both understood. In the way adults understand these things without saying them, that a door being open and a career picking back up exactly where it left off are two very different promises. What replaced that career was a life measured in smaller units of time. 15-minute increments between medications. 2-hour windows between when a nausea medication kicked in and when it wore off again. I learned to read Mark's face for pain he wouldn't admit to. Learned the difference between the silence that meant he was resting and the silence that meant he was gritting through something he didn't want me to see. I learned how to talk an insurance company out of denying a claim at 9 at night. How to drive to an all-night pharmacy without really being able to see the road clearly through exhaustion. How to hold a conversation about hospice planning with a version of calm I didn't actually feel. None of this, I want to be clear, was a burden I resented. I would have done every single hour of it again, twice over, without hesitation. What I resented, what I still, if I'm honest, carry some anger about, was the complete absence of anyone else in that family stepping in to share even a fraction of it, and the fact that not one of them ever seemed to register that absence as anything worth acknowledging, let alone apologizing for. There's one more thing from those months I need to tell you, because it becomes important later, even though at the time it seemed like nothing at all. In his last few months, Mark started taking phone calls in his study with the door closed. Short calls mostly, sometimes in the evening after I'd gone up to check on things upstairs. When I asked, he'd wave a hand and say, "Just insurance stuff, don't worry about it, you have enough on your plate." And I believed him. Not because I was naive, but because trust is what 15 years of a good marriage buys you. I had no reason to think he was hiding something from me that mattered. I had every reason to think exactly the opposite. I didn't understand then that he was hiding something for me. Not from me. There's one memory from those final months I still carry with me every single day. It was late, maybe 10 at night, and he was having one of his better evenings. Clear-eyed, present, less pain than usual. He reached over and took my hand, and he looked at me with a kind of seriousness I hadn't seen from him since our wedding day. "You're the only real family I've had in that house for years," he said. "I need you to remember that, whatever happens after." I squeezed his hand and told him I loved him, and I didn't ask him what he meant by "whatever happens after," because I thought he meant grief. I thought he meant the ordinary terrible business of loss. I had no idea he meant something else entirely. Something with a lawyer's signature on it, sitting in a drawer downstairs, waiting. He died on a Thursday morning in early spring, just after 6 a.m., in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and the coffee I hadn't had the chance to drink. It was quiet. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't feel real for a long time afterward. I held his hand until a nurse gently told me it was time to let the room do what it needed to do. And I remember walking out into a hallway with fluorescent lighting that felt far too bright for what had just happened, and thinking, I don't know how to do the next part of my life. I want to be careful here. Because grief isn't the subject of this story, even though it's the room this whole story lives in. What I'll tell you is that within 48 hours, Vanessa had taken over handling the arrangements. She picked the funeral home. She picked the flowers. She wrote the program. She made every single decision about how my husband would be buried, and she did it without calling me once. When I arrived at the funeral home for the viewing, I found out the seating had already been assigned. I wasn't in the front row. I was in the second, behind Mark's parents, his aunts and uncles, his cousins, to keep it simple for immediate family, Vanessa explained, when I asked. With a tone so reasonable it took me a full minute to understand what she'd actually just told me. I was his wife. I had been his caregiver for 18 months. I had held his hand as he died 3 days earlier. And I was being told, quietly and politely, that I didn't count as immediate family at my own husband's funeral. I stood in that reception hall in a black dress I'd bought 2 days earlier, because I hadn't had one appropriate for burying a husband, holding a program Vanessa had written without asking me a single question about how Mark would have wanted to be remembered. She'd chosen a photo of him from a family ski trip years before we'd even met. A good photo, I'll admit, but not one that had anything to do with the man I'd spent 15 years building a life with. Not our wedding photo. Not a single picture from the life we'd actually shared. I remember standing there, looking at a stranger's version of my husband printed on cream cardstock, and understanding in a small, quiet way exactly what kind of fight this was going to be, long before I understood there was going to be a fight at all. That was the moment Vanessa said the thing I now think of as her first direct shot. The line that told me, if I'd been paying full attention, exactly what was coming. She found me alone near the coat room, checking my phone for something to do with my hands, and she said, in the gentlest voice you can imagine, the kind of voice you'd use to deliver bad medical news, "I know this is hard, but let's be practical. This isn't really your family to plan for anymore, is it?" I didn't say anything. I want to tell you I had a sharp comeback ready, something dignified and cutting. But the truth is I just stood there, absorbing it the way I'd absorbed everything else for years. And then I went home, alone, to a house that used to have 2 people living in it. 2 weeks after the funeral. I was clearing out Mark's desk, not with any urgency, just trying to find small tasks to fill the hours, when I found a sealed envelope tucked behind a drawer divider. My name was on the front in his handwriting. Below it, a line that stopped me cold. "Rachel. Only if it gets difficult." I sat on the floor of his study for a long time holding that envelope. Every instinct in me wanted to tear it open right there. But something else, call it intuition, call it 15 years of knowing how my husband's mind worked, told me to wait. If he'd written something meant for a specific kind of difficulty, I wanted to know I actually needed it before I used it. I set it back in the drawer. A few days later, Mark's mother called. Her voice had that practiced warmth I'd learned over the years to be wary of. "The family wants to get together," she said, "to sort out Mark's things properly. Together." She emphasized together, like it was a gift she was offering me. Something in my stomach went tight the moment she said it. I couldn't have told you why, exactly. I had no proof of anything, no evidence this was going to be anything other than what she claimed. But I'd spent 3 years learning the particular temperature of that family's kindness, and this call had the wrong temperature. I agreed to go anyway. What was I going to say? No. I still believed at that point that showing up and being reasonable was the only card I had to play. Nobody mentioned that a lawyer would be there. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it tells you everything about how that family saw the meeting before it even happened. They didn't think they needed a lawyer in the room to divide up what they'd already decided was rightfully theirs. The meeting, in their minds, was theirs to control from the first word to the last. The night before, I sat on the study floor again with that sealed envelope in my lap. I almost opened it. I got as far as running my thumb under the flap before I stopped myself and set it back down. In case I need it after, I told myself. It wasn't fear that made me wait. It was something closer to control. The first real control I'd felt in weeks. I decided that whatever happened in that room the next day, I would meet it with what I actually knew, not what I hoped might be waiting in an envelope. If I needed Mark's last words to save me, I'd read them. But I wasn't going to lean on a maybe before I even walked in the door. The meeting was set at Mark's parents' house, in the same formal dining room where I'd once been introduced as Mark's girlfriend, 3 years into our marriage. 6 chairs plus mine, Vanessa, Mark's mother and father, an aunt I barely knew, and Diane, a family friend who'd known Mark since childhood. The closest thing to a neutral party in that room, though I'd soon learn neutral doesn't mean brave. Vanessa opened the meeting with a manila folder in front of her, like she'd prepared an agenda. She talked in that same reasonable voice about keeping things fair and what Mark would have wanted for the family as a whole, as though Mark's wishes were a thing she was uniquely positioned to interpret, 3 weeks after his death, for a wife who'd spent every night of his illness beside him. Then she stood, and she delivered the line slowly, like she'd rehearsed the pacing of it. Let's be honest. She's not even family. She gets nothing. Silence. I watched Mark's father look away, down at his own folded hands. I watched his mother say absolutely nothing, her face carefully arranged into something between sadness and agreement. I watched Diane shift in her chair, uncomfortable, clearly unhappy, and say nothing either. 12 chairs worth of silence, and not one voice raised on my behalf. I sat there and let it happen. Not because I had no words, I had plenty, believe me, but because some part of me had already decided that whatever came next in that room wasn't going to be won by me shouting over Vanessa's rehearsed cruelty. If this family wanted to watch me disappear quietly one more time, I was going to let them believe for just a few more minutes that it was working. That's when the knock came at the door. A man in a gray suit stepped into the dining room, briefcase in hand, and introduced himself with a calm that immediately reset the temperature of the entire room. "Mr. Halston," he said. "Mark's estate attorney." He looked around at the stunned faces, at Vanessa's folder now sitting forgotten in front of her, and added, without a trace of drama, "I was instructed to attend today regardless of how this conversation went." Mr. Halston set his briefcase on an empty chair and opened it with the unhurried patience of a man who had done this exact kind of thing before, in exactly this kind of room. "Before this meeting goes any further," he said, "I need to read something Mark asked me to prepare in the event this exact conversation happened." This exact conversation. I watched those 3 words land on Vanessa's face like a slap. What he told the room next rearranged everything. 8 months before he died, Mark had moved the house and the bulk of his assets into an irrevocable trust, naming me, Rachel, as sole beneficiary. He hadn't done it in a moment of panic near the end. He'd done it deliberately, carefully, 8 full months before his death, with legal counsel and full documentation. And he'd done it, Halston explained, because of something he'd overheard. Months earlier, Mark had walked past a phone call, his sister, talking to their mother, in which Vanessa said plainly that I wouldn't get a cent if she had any say in it. He never told me he'd heard that. He never confronted her about it. He just quietly, methodically, made sure her opinion would never matter. Halston read a short passage from a letter Mark had left, his voice steady in a room that had gone completely, totally silent. "If you're hearing this, it's because my family did exactly what I was afraid they would. Rachel isn't an outsider. She's the only person who never once treated our marriage like a transaction." I want to describe Vanessa's face in that moment, because I've thought about it 100 times since. It wasn't embarrassment. I think if it had been embarrassment, some part of this story might have gone differently. She might have apologized, might have found some small grace in being caught. What crossed her face instead was pure shock, and right behind it, fast and unmistakable, anger. Not at herself, at me, as if I had engineered this, as if my husband's love for me was something I'd extracted from him through some trick she simply hadn't caught in time. I didn't look at her. I looked at the letter in Halston's hands, at my husband's handwriting on the page behind the typed legal language, and I stayed very, very still. Not because I was afraid to react, because for the first time in that room, in that house, in 3 years of small daily erasures, I finally had nothing left to prove. I'd love to tell you that was the end of it, that the truth landed, and the family absorbed it, and everyone went quietly home to reckon with what they'd almost done. That's not what happened. If anything, the reveal only made Vanessa more dangerous. She refused to accept it on the spot. Right there in the dining room, before Halston had even closed his briefcase, she was already building her counter-narrative. That I must have manipulated Mark while he was sick and vulnerable. That a man in that condition couldn't have made a decision like that clearly. That this needed to be looked into. Within the week, she'd hired her own attorney to explore contesting the trust. And she didn't stop at legal channels. She started talking. To cousins, to family friends, to people Mark and I had known for years. Telling a version of events where I'd isolated Mark from his family during his illness. Cutting off visits, controlling access to him in his final months. It wasn't true. Not one word of it was true. But grief makes people credulous. And a confident lie told by a grieving sister carries a strange kind of weight, even when it shouldn't. I felt the cost of that lie almost immediately. 2 family events came and went that I wasn't invited to. Cousins I'd been genuinely close with, people I'd exchanged birthday cards with for a decade, went quiet on me, unsure, I think, who to believe, and unwilling to ask me directly. There's a particular kind of loneliness in being lied about that I don't think people fully understand until they've lived it. It's not just that people believe the lie exactly. It's that most people don't decide anything at all. They just quietly step back, wait to see which version wins, And in the meantime, you disappear from birthday invitations and group texts and casual weekend plans, not because anyone made a decision to exclude you, but because uncertainty is easier to manage by simply not choosing. I lost an entire social layer of my life that spring, not to any dramatic falling out, but to a slow, cowardly kind of erosion that never announced itself and never really explained itself either. I called one cousin directly, someone I genuinely thought of as a friend, not just family by marriage, and asked her plainly what she'd heard. She hedged, said she didn't want to get in the middle of it. I told her there was no middle, that either I had isolated a dying man from his family, which was a lie, or I hadn't, which was the truth, and that there wasn't really a third option where both things were a little bit true. She didn't have an answer for that. We haven't spoken much since, and I've made a kind of peace with that, even though it still stings some days. But the moment that actually broke something in me wasn't the funeral seating, and it wasn't even the meeting. It was a group text a cousin forwarded me almost as an afterthought, a chain of messages between Vanessa and a few relatives planning some logistics for an upcoming gathering. Buried in the middle of it, Vanessa had referred to me as the widow, allegedly. The widow, allegedly. I'd sat beside my husband's hospital bed at 2 a.m. for 18 months. I'd been at his side when he took his last breath. And his own sister, in a private conversation she thought I'd never see, couldn't even grant me the word widow without a qualifier attached to it. That stung more than the meeting did. The meeting, at least, had been public, a performance for an audience, however small. This was private. This was what Vanessa actually believed, unfiltered, when she thought no one who mattered was watching. About 3 weeks into the legal back and forth, Vanessa's attorney proposed something they framed as a compromise. I could keep the bulk of the estate, the house, the majority of the assets, if I agreed to sign over a percentage to Vanessa. The pitch was that this would preserve the family relationship and let everyone avoid a contest that could drag on for a year or longer, draining money and energy neither side particularly wanted to spend. On paper, it sounded almost reasonable. That's the thing about these offers. They're built to sound reasonable. And then Mark's father called me. Not Vanessa this time, him. His voice was different than it had been in that dining room, smaller, almost pleading. "I just want this family to survive this," he said. "Can't you just let her have something? For peace, I want to be honest with you, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most. More than the reveal, more than the meeting." I almost said yes. I was tired. I was grieving a husband who'd been gone barely a month. I didn't want a courtroom. I didn't want a fight that would follow me into every future holiday for the rest of my life. Part of me, a real human part of me, not a weak part, just wanted the whole thing to be over. Even if over meant giving something up, I didn't legally have to give. That night, I finally opened the sealed envelope from Mark's desk. I'd been carrying it around for weeks by then, unopened, waiting for a moment I could feel in my chest was the right one. This was it. Inside was a fuller letter than the excerpt Halston had read. Mark, in his own words, addressing not just the family's cruelty, but the exact temptation I was sitting with that very night, as if he'd somehow known it was coming. "They'll ask you to give something up to keep the peace," he wrote. "Don't. The peace was never real if it depended on you disappearing a little every time." I read that line 4 or 5 times before it fully landed. Every holiday seating chart, every forgotten invitation, every toast to real family that pointedly left me out, every one of those moments had been, in its own small way, exactly this: an ask for me to give up a little more of my place, a little more of myself, in exchange for a peace that only ever seemed to exist on their terms. Mark had seen it. He'd seen all of it, apparently, more clearly than I'd ever let myself admit while he was alive to comfort me through it. I called my own attorney the next morning. I declined the settlement. No dramatic phone call to Vanessa, no confrontation, no scene. Just a calm, formal letter through the proper legal channels, stating that I would not be signing over any portion of the trust, and that I expected the estate to be honored exactly as my husband had structured it. There's one scene from that week I still think about often. I was driving a signed document over to my attorney's office, and my route happened to take me past Mark's parents' house. Through the front window, I could see the family gathered on the porch. Vanessa, her husband, the kids, Mark's parents. A small, ordinary evening I wasn't part of anymore, and I understood now. Hadn't really been part of for a long time before Mark even got sick. I slowed the car. For a second, I considered stopping. Some old habit in me, some leftover instinct to smooth things over, to be the reasonable one, to walk up those porch steps and try one more time to be included. I didn't stop. I kept driving. I think of that moment now as my version of driving past the party you weren't invited to. The moment you choose yourself with absolutely no one watching. No audience to perform the choice for. No one to witness the strength it took. Just me, alone in a car, foot steady on the gas pedal, finally understanding that I didn't need their porch light to know I was standing somewhere solid. The contest, such as it was, went to mediation a few months later. It didn't last long. Mark had been more careful than any of us, myself included, had fully understood. Those private phone calls in his study, the ones he'd told me were just insurance stuff. They'd been calls to his attorney, laying the groundwork for a trust so carefully documented, so airtight in its construction, that Vanessa's attorney essentially advised her the contest wasn't winnable. It ended quietly, without a trial, without headlines, without any of the dramatic courtroom reckoning you might expect from a story like this. The real reckoning happened somewhere I wasn't. Even in the room for Diane, the family friend who'd sat silently, at that first meeting, reached out to me privately, months later over coffee. She told me something I hadn't known, that several relatives had been uncomfortable with how Vanessa handled things from the very start. The funeral seating, the meeting, the whispered accusations that followed. They just hadn't wanted to get involved at the time. Nobody ever does in families like this, until the involvement is unavoidable. But something had shifted since. Vanessa's version of events, the isolation story, the manipulation story, had started to crack under its own weight, especially once it became clear the trust had survived a legal contest her own family had watched her lose. Word travels slowly in families, through cousins and holiday phone calls and half-finished conversations, but it travels. At the next holiday gathering, fewer people sat near Vanessa. Fewer people took her side, unprompted the way they used to. Her own parents, Diane told me, had grown noticeably more distant from her account of what had happened. Not a dramatic disowning. Nothing so clean as that. Just a slow, cumulative cooling. The kind of social cost that never makes headlines but changes a person's whole standing in a room over time. I wasn't there for any of it. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters to the shape of this story. I didn't engineer Vanessa's downfall. I didn't call cousins to correct the record or campaign for anyone's sympathy. I simply stopped disappearing, and the truth did the rest of the work on its own. Delivered to me secondhand, months later, over a cup of coffee with a woman who'd finally found her voice a little too late to matter to the outcome, but not too late to matter to me. A year passed. I still live in that house, fully mine now, the way it was always meant to be, according to the man who loved me enough to make sure of it in writing. I repainted the guest room a soft sage green mark, and I had talked about years earlier and never gotten around to. I planted the garden bed off the back porch he used to sketch out on napkins during his better weeks of chemo, the one he never got to see finished. It bloomed this spring for the first time. I sat out there for a long time the first morning I saw it, and I cried, but it wasn't the same kind of crying as before. I have a small found family now, and I don't say that lightly. Diane comes over most Sundays. 2 cousins, the ones who never stopped answering my calls, even during the worst of it, come by for dinner most months. Low-key, nothing performed about it, just people who showed up because they wanted to, not because a seating chart told them where to sit. I visit Mark's grave more than I probably need to, if I'm honest. I sit there and tell him things. Small things, mostly, the garden, work, a stray cat that's decided our porch is its porch now. Last time I went, I told him what had happened. All of it. The meeting, the letter, Vanessa's slow unraveling, the porch I drove past without stopping. And I told him something else. 2. A version of his own words, handed back to him. "Turns out you were right," I said. "You were my real family." I just needed everyone else to hear it too. If there's a thesis to this whole story, the thing I'd want you to walk away with, if you've stayed with me this long, it's this. Family was never the room that raised you, or the table you were seated at, or the name on an invitation somebody forgot to write. Family is the person who made sure, in the end, that you'd never again have to beg for a seat at the table. I got that. Late, and at the cost of more than I ever should have had to pay, but I got it. If someone ever told you that you weren't real family, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in that room, in Rachel's chair, hearing those words with nobody standing up for you. And if this story meant something to you, if you felt even a little bit of that dining room silence in your own chest, do me a favor and subscribe to her Quiet Reckoning. We tell these stories every week, the ones about the people who got underestimated, pushed to the edges, and quietly, completely, proven right in the end. I'll see you in the next one.